Okay, part 3. Hopefully we can finish this one in this part of the video for chapter 2. Okay, so the next question was then, how do these British colonists and the natives adapt to each other, and how do they interact? So the Indians in New England, English settlers were pouring into this region that was populated by the American Indians and considered them wild pagans. Some areas the Indians flourished with the settlers, others they were displaced or decimated by the Europeans that moved in. French and the Dutch had a much more positive relationship, as we mentioned in chapter 1, mostly because of their fur trade business that they had set up. English often had more of their God-given right attitude towards that area and to that settlement. Coastal Indians taught English how to plant corn, use fish for fertilizer, develop trade, but from the period of 1610 to 1675, smallpox was going to devastate American Indian populations. In some cases, some areas in Maine, some of the tribes had gone from 12,000 to 3,000. Southern New England tribes had gone from 65,000 to 10. And those similar trends and numbers were seen throughout all of the settlement. The Pequot War, 1637, when it was clear that the English were there for permanent settlement, conflict was going to be inevitable because of the clash of who had right to be where. Indians that survived epidemics refused to leave their land, were forced out. The natives were, at one point, one of them was accused of murdering a Massachusetts colonist, and the colonists will revenge by setting fire to their village and killing anybody, men, women, children, who fled the flames of the fire within the village. They will reorganize, the Indians reorganize their survivors and attack, and they will, the colonists with other allies, other native allies, will capture survivors and kill hundreds of them, and some will be sold into slavery. The Treaty of Hartford that was created 1638 basically dissolves that Pequot nation and forced them to acknowledge their subordination to the Jamestown government. Aftermath of this war was that there was an increased colonial settlement of conquered native lands, and so more white settlement pushed through the land that had been taken from the natives that had inhabited there. King Philip's War, after this, the previous Native American struggle, the English and the natives will keep mostly peaceful relations during that time, using fur trade as an incentive, and continued growth of colonists, and the decline of some of those animal populations for fur and for hides meant more poverty level for the natives. King Philip, also known as Metacomet, is going to bring an end to this peaceful time after the Hartford Treaty. The English had an aggressive campaign to win a lot of the natives over to Christianity and to try to assimilate them. And the natives are not going to want to assimilate, so they're going to start to fight back. Indians will eventually be worn down from shortages. Metacomet's wife and son were sold into slavery, and he himself is captured and killed. Actually, they put his severed head outside of Plymouth for 20 years as an example. Victory from King Philip's War meant more Puritan religious, legal, economic, and political control over the remaining natives. A couple of other images. Actually, let's see if I can move those so you can see both. There we go. Okay, so to what extent did the English Civil War serve as a turning point, and what characteristics were there before and after that? The English Civil War, as it affected America, 1640 English settlers in New England and Chesapeake established basically two great presence at that point, and the Dutch were in between. During the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell's Puritan dictatorship in the colonies, during that time, the colonies were pretty much ignored. Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, all of the New England pretty much had a joint defense against the Dutch, the French, the natives, kind of behaving like a sovereign power, made treaties, declared war. Massachusetts was the least involved. Eventually they kicked them out, but they kind of collaborated together in the New England northern part. Virginia, Maryland, the Chesapeake were almost independent of English control during that time, kind of rule independently away from a royal governor, grew very quickly. 1649 is when that Maryland Act of Toleration that we mentioned before came in, protecting Puritans. At one point was temporarily revoked but later restored to try to keep peace among the different religious groups that were there. Restoration in England was pretty painless restoration of previous governments in the colonies. They reconfirmed the charters, had a few new royal charters. Most colonies were still retaining their self-government corporations. Some of the other ones, like New Haven, was absorbed into Connecticut, but for the most part it was pretty easy. In the Carolinas, settling into the Carolinas in those southern states, restoration of Charles II, he will reward the 8 lord proprietors with the ownership of the region, with the new colonies that were set up. Other colonies that were set up during this time: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. We'll talk about those. The Carolinas, the northern part, most of the people that were coming down from Virginia and kind of scattering into different farms, really no town until 1704 within that area. The southern part of the Carolinas was the most promising. They recruited British planters from the Caribbean, Barbados, trying to replicate some of the West Indies plantations, bringing in the slave trade. Barbados slave codes came from South Carolina, or came from Barbados to South Carolina, and then those slave codes will eventually start to disperse among the rest of the colonies. The fundamental constitutions of Carolina were set up, basically formed by Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper and his secretary John Locke, and set up provisions for an elaborate nobility, large land grants, even a head right system for those who could afford the cost of transit. They also granted religious freedom and toleration, even to Jews and heathens, anyone who was without religion. And then looking into labor force. So the Carolinas, southern states, Chesapeake, the farther south you go, the more labor intensive a lot of the different crops would demand. South Carolina wanted to focus on commercial crops, but the land needed a lot of labor. They brought African slaves and white indentured servants, but a very quick way to make money and develop trade was with the natives. They would average about 54,000 deerskins of trade. A lot of growing trade, a lot of growing contact. But it was part of it too was providing goods for Indians who would capture rival natives and bring them and have them sell them into slavery to the colonists. 1670 to 1715, more Indian slaves were exported than Africans were imported. Slave trading led to struggles between tribes, more colonial warfare, massive internal migrations, and the fear of slave raids disrupted normal Native American life. Yamasee War was Creeks, Cherokees, others who were led by the whites to destroy a neighboring town, take the women and children captive. A lot more conflict as they did not get high payment for their slaves. The Yamasees did not get high payments because they owed a lot of debt, and so instead they will attack and cause a lot of colonists to flee the Charleston area around where this was going on. The middle colony, settling the middle colonies. New Netherland originally had been set up as a Dutch colony. Since Henry Hudson had explored the region, had a very positive relationship with the natives. They were very involved in fur trading. They were more focused on making profits than religious and ethnic conditions. The Swedish are going to establish Fort Christina, eventually taken over by the Dutch, but they will leave the legacy of log cabins. The Dutch, coming into this, had the largest merchant fleet, very high standard of living. They were open to diversity, welcomed anybody, any exile even, but they grew too rapidly and weren't able to keep control of all of their locations. The Dutch West India Company established large land grants in exchange for bringing in 50 people or more, basically transplanting the feudal manor system, a plan called freedoms and exemptions. One of the largest examples was one of the settlers who acquired 700,000 acres in the Hudson Valley area. Absolute control of the government was by the Dutch West India Company appointed governor, usually a corrupt person who came into power there. New Amsterdam was extremely diverse. People were indifferent to a lot of things. That's why when Peter Stuyvesant called for arms against the British fleet coming in trying to take over the colony from the Dutch, not a lot of people responded. Dutch remnants still remain. Names like Wall Street, Broadway, and some of the architecture, some of the names still set up as a reminder or remainder from the Dutch settlement there. Judaism in North America was very small numbers, starting to settle in the Middle Colonies area. Stuyvesant was ordered by the Dutch West India Company to let them in, but they will have to continue to fight for equal rights. Population of Jews grows very slowly. By the time the American Revolution comes around, there's still not one rabbi in North America at that point. Warfare among some of the natives, like the Iroquois League, warfare intensified between the Indians and the Europeans. They will forge an alliance, outnumber the Dutch, and in the early 1600s, 50 chiefs and 12,000 members make up the Iroquois Confederacy to be a fighting force against those Europeans. In New Jersey, after conquering New Netherland, the Duke of York, King of England's brother, gave the land to Sir George Carteret and Lord John Buckley, who will split the territory of New Jersey, sell part of it to William Penn, and they later will combine West and East Jersey into a royal colony in 1702. And speaking of William Penn, Pennsylvania was set up with William Penn and set up as a colony to be his holy experiment. A lot of it was based on the ideas and the beliefs of Quakers, also known as the Society of Friends, as a belief system founded by George Fox, who believed in the inner light, discarded all formality, refused to take oaths. They embraced pacifism, promote religious freedom for everyone, believed in gender equality, involved women in religious affairs, allowed them to pray in worship services. They settled in West Jersey as part of it, and William Penn will set up a colony from his father's estate. Money that was owed to his father by the king came in form of a land grant to set up in Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods. His whole experiment, trying to see, allowing people to migrate, to come in, very open, very democratic compared to many of the other colonies. Government there in Pennsylvania was the 3 frames of government. Freemen who pay taxes or own property elect the council members. The governor cannot veto, but Penn had reserved that right to veto laws, and also within Delaware as well. In Georgia, the last British colony, brought enslaved Africans in, was set up as a military buffer to the rest of the colonies from Spanish Florida. It also had the opportunity to bring over those who were in prison, mostly debtors' prison, had the opportunity to go to the colonies as an indentured servant rather than sit in a European jail. And a lot of that came from the fact that they were overcrowded. The founder of Georgia was James Oglethorpe. He was a general. He organized their defenses. He championed prison reform. 1733, founded Savannah, and had refugees from all over. Eventually, at one point, refugees from Austria and Germany outnumbered the English within Georgia. Economic exports failed at first, which they tried wine and silk first, but later export rice, indigo, lumber, beef, and pork. At first, they tried to say no slavery and have regulations to have no drinking, but both were eventually disbanded. Okay, a couple of different settlements within New Netherland, New Sweden. There's Henry Hudson's original exploration. 1609 was his first trip over. And then the last question was, why was it possible for England to establish successful colonies by 1700? And really, by the early 18th century, England was bypassing the French and the Spanish in the New World. American colonists were better fed, clothed, housed than any other colonies within that North American area. There were some failures, especially when dealing with environmental issues and death rates, but others will begin to flourish because of opportunities. They functioned greatly on private investment, very minimal control by the monarchs, and especially for a long time kind of ignored by England's monarchs. Geography was a big part of why it was so condensed. There's no major rivers to carry them away inland. There was no way to really venture past the Appalachian Mountains, so the settlements are kind of like here in the New England area. They're very close together. They don't spread out very far, mostly because there wasn't a way to do so. Okay, so that sums up chapter 2. This is all done.